So first of all, thank you so very much for coming and carving out time for us. And oh, you have a prop master behind you.
I do. And she's really good.
Would that be Leslie Lear, your wife?
It might be. That might be.
Yeah, such a treat, truly, for you to be here. So thank you.
Lauren, thank you for having me. I had such a great time talking with you the last time. We had such a good conversation. And I love the fact that you know what you're talking about. It's so fun to talk story with somebody who knows story.
I feel the same way, and I learned so much from you. So it's fun to also know you personally.
Yeah.
So let's just start with this topic of, so your latest book, for everyone who is here, is The Anatomy of Genres, How Story Forms Explain How the World Works.
Yep.
So it's a deep dive into this world of genre, which I wanted to open this just by giving maybe a little bit of context for just even the topic of genres. Because I feel like, and I come from the screenwriting world, I feel like it's something that I had a lot of conversations about when I worked as a screenwriter, and maybe less so. And maybe it's just because I'm so immersed in the world of memoir that it just doesn't seem like a topic that comes up quite often. And maybe it's, if I were hanging out with romance writers or Western writers, maybe we would be talking about it. I don't know. But one, do you agree with that it's more commonly a topic in the screenwriting world? Am I sort of off on that? And two, I'm just, if you could maybe kind of as an entree into all of this, why is the topic of genres such an important topic when you're a writer, regardless of what you're writing?
Well, first of all, it's certainly a huge topic in the screenwriting world. But I think it's also, especially certainly in the last 10 years, has been a huge topic in the fiction world. And partly that's because of the power of Amazon, because all of these books, all of these novels are being categorized based on genres and based on subgenres, sometimes very minute, specialized subgenres. So writers, especially indie novelists, are extremely aware of genre because it makes all the difference in the world. And the reason for that is that really since Star Wars first came out in the late 70s, it revolutionized popular storytelling in every medium. And that's because Star Wars was the first film to mix multiple genres in the same story. And that had a massive effect in terms of its ability to sell worldwide. And now in every medium, the money people, the publisher, the studio, whatever, they want the biggest possible outreach in a worldwide market. It is no longer the US market. They want the worldwide market. So genres are types of plot, and they are plot types that have been worked out over decades, sometimes centuries, and in the case of myth, over thousands of years, which means that they are really well thought out. They've had all the kinks of the system dealt with, and they tell the best story dealing with that particular issue that genre deals with. And by that, I mean, they tell it in the most dramatic way possible. Now, a lot of writers are aware of the fact that genres are plot types, and plot systems, because there is a sequence. Each genre is a sequence of anywhere from 15 to 20 plot beats that come in a particular order that is most dramatic for affecting the audience. What most writers don't get, and which is what I go into great detail in the book, is that genres are theme systems. Each one expresses a different life philosophy for how to live successfully in the world. And that's their great power. That's the real reason that people keep going back to their particular genre every time, because it's not that just that they like those plot beats coming in that sequence. Obviously they do, but they know those beats, they know them cold. So they're not getting surprised there. What's really affecting them at the deepest level is that it expresses a life philosophy and a set of values that they believe, that they want to live their life by. And so that has tremendous power, both for a particular audience and the ability to take that any particular story to a worldwide audience.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that because I feel like it'll help to anchor what you're saying in a specific genre so we understand what you're talking about. But before we jump into memoir specifically, can you just, because I'm really interested in what you'd said, and I know it's kind of a minor point, but you said Amazon has made all the difference, and these writers in the fiction world are very aware of subgenres. What do you mean by that specifically? What are people realizing?
Well, what they're realizing, if you're an indie novelist, you have to sell it yourself. And so if you are publishing a novel by one of the big houses, they're doing that work for you. They have all those contacts, they have the distribution and so on. But as an indie novelist, you're doing that work. And the way Amazon works, its algorithms work is they're going to a particular audience. They're hitting the engaged audience of that particular genre. For example, paranormal romance. That is a subgenre of romance, right? And people who like paranormal romance really like paranormal romance. So Amazon wants to feed them books in that category because then they'll buy it. And so this is why Amazon is so massively powerful, because they dictate not just how it's sold, but then how it's written and how authors, in terms of, especially when they're indie novelists, try to build their brand, become known as the best paranormal romance writer. And that's the only way as an indie novelist you can actually make a living.
I see. This makes so much sense. Okay, so let's dive in specifically to memoir. Okay, so the life philosophy, you just mentioned that every genre has a life philosophy that it's expressing through the story. And with memoir, you say that the life philosophy is memoir is not about the past, it's about creating the future. Is that
correct?
Is that correct? Okay. So what do you mean by that?
Well, this goes to how a lot of people misconceive, they misunderstand what their particular genre is really about. Now, if you ask people, well, what is memoir? Well, memoir is, well, we look at, it's a story about your past. Well, yes, it is, but that's not the point. The point of it is to look at your past, to see the patterns that happened in your life that affected the decisions that you made in your life, that then have affected your life all the way up until this point. But the point of looking back at yourself, looking back at your life, is to be able to change those patterns so that you have a better future. That's what a great memoir does. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's just saying, well, this happened and this happened and this happened, and you know, that was really it was really painful for me, and so on. And that has some emotional value to it. But what we're really looking for is, what does the act of looking back do so that you can change what you do going forward? Mm-hmm. And that's what the great memoirs do. So
can you, and I don't want to dive into other genres, but I would love to give everyone here a taste of like, what's a life philosophy, say, of romance, or what's a life philosophy of detective, or, you know, do you?
Sure, absolutely. In the book, I track the genres from lowest to highest, meaning the most primal, starting with horror, going up to what I consider to be the highest genres, which are the final three are fantasy, detective, and ending with love. And it's not that the life philosophy of any one of those is better than the others. It's just that the first two, horror and action, are the most basic. Horror is about how do you face your own death? How do you confront the fact that you will at some point die? And it says you do that by, first of all, realizing you are going to, by living as though you will die, which means that you're going to be motivated to make choices now that can make a better life for the time you have left.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's actually, horror is usually thought of as a very low form. In fact, the lowest rated of all the genres. It's normally thought of as this, a slasher film, and a lot of them are. But at its most powerful, it's about how do we confront our own end and make changes to have a good life going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Action is about success. It is the techniques for how to win.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very primal. It's, horror is the first, of course, because it's life versus death. But action is next because it's the first in the human realm, which is you have to act to live. And the basic philosophy of action is 90% of success is just taking action.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Just quit sitting there and go do something, come up with a goal. It is extremely goal focused, and it gives us these sequence of things that we do to be successful, starting with come up with a very clear goal and then take persistent action to get that and do not give up.
Mm-hmm.
So as I go through each of the one after that is myth, which is about the life process. And then we get to memoir, which is about creating the self. Mm-hmm. And that's its great power. Mm-hmm. As I say, we're just talking about, how do you create your future? Well, what does that mean in the deepest sense? It is in memoir, you are in over the course of your life, you are creating yourself throughout your life. Memoir is the most powerful tool we have to create our true self. Because in the act of looking at ourselves, of our entire life in the big picture, in other words, taking a strategic view, we are able to do more to create and focus and become the great individual that we want to be than any other tool that the human mind has. That's why memoir is incredibly powerful, and why I always tell writers, I tell human beings, you need to write your memoir, right? As I say in the book, writing a memoir isn't on the bucket list, it is the bucket list. It is that powerful.
So that's a real testament to memoir. I love that. I just want to hold that for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about now kind of breaking it down a little bit more into these beats that you talk about. So you say there's usually, what did you say, 15 to 20 beats?
Typically, yeah.
In each genre that is that defines the genre. And are beats the same as you? Okay, I'm going to step back for a second. You say that many writers believe they can master their genre by simply tossing in a few tropes of the form. So before maybe we dive into the actual fundamental beats, what do you mean by tropes, and where do we get sidetracked?
Well, tropes is one of those terms. It's very broad. It's one of those things that people typically, well, I know what tropes are, but then you say, well, what are they? And then it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. And really a trope is simply a story element. It is an individual story element. You can have a character trope. You can have a plot trope. Like in the romance story, a trope is the bad boy. And so what a lot of writers do is they think, well, I know my genre and I know there's this trope and that trope and so on, and I'll grab a few of them and put them together and I've got my story. Well, here's the problem. Tropes are individual elements. Genres are entire systems. It's the difference of night and day.
Mhm.
Because when you just throw tropes together, individual story elements together, you don't get a build.
Mhm.
You don't get an overall plot sequence.
Mhm.
And this is especially a problem in memoir, because probably the biggest problem in memoir as a form is that it tends to have very little plot.
Mhm.
And this comes from many things, but one of the things it comes from is a misunderstanding that people have about how memoir works. They think, well, memoir should be the easiest thing in the world to write. All you do is just list what happened to you,
Mhm.
right? Well, events are not plot. Those are different things.
Mhm.
And it goes to your point about what is a plot beat? What is a story beat? A beat is an action with structural power, with structural importance. In other words, it's not just a single event that's happening. It is part of a larger structural system that is, and it's that sequence of plot beats that gives you the form and gives you the dramatic power that individual tropes cannot give you.
Right, right. What would be an example of a trope in memoir?
The classic memoirs very different from other genres for this very reason. And it's, again, one of the reasons why the biggest difficulty in memoir is getting enough plot. It's because it's a true story.
Mhm.
So this element of trope is not nearly as much of a problem. If having an individual thinking in terms of individual beats is a problem, but you're not going to get a trope other than the general sense that outsiders have about memoir, which is, oh, it's all about what happened to you when you were a kid and you were abused by your parents. I mean, if you ask the general public, what is a memoir, if they have any view on it at all, they'll say, well, it's about what happened to you when you were a kid. And that obviously is nowhere close to defining this form, one of the most powerful story forms in the world. But that would be an example of
Mhm. Right.
that mentality, that single element mentality that you were applying to an entire genre.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Makes sense. So as far as the beats of memoir, I mean, it would be, I think we don't have the time to go through all of them. Can we talk about some of them?
Of course.
Some of the beats. So I'm going to pick out a few that kind of help open my own mind. And I think
Sure.
part of what's interesting about reading how you talk about memoir is some fresh language, that I
Yeah.
kind of resonates for me, and yet I haven't used it necessarily before. So even the very first one, Story World, and you call it a system of slavery,
Right.
is the very first story beat you list.
Yeah.
And I would like for you to talk about that.
System of slavery is something that is found in really good memoirs. And it comes out again of this problem that we get with Peanut loves to help me
Upstaged.
story meetings here. She feels I can't handle it on my own. So, but the typical approach to memoir is to, as I mentioned, is let's list the events in chronological order, and beginning with, depending on where you start the frame, but often it is in childhood. And by immediately going to that specific event, what the writer is missing is the deeper system that formed those events, that formed the actions that occurred to the hero. And so what you see in really good memoirs is that there is some sense of a system of slavery that is trapping all of the people in the story, not just the hero. Because then this is another way that we get out of the strictly me versus them. I was, the hero, and my opponents were bad people, and they did these things to me. And so you get this very simple, good versus evil distinction that we don't want to get in our story. And what that does is it gets you thinking in terms of the entire story world, and what is the system of logic or ethic or way of thinking that caused these problems. I talk about, in the chapter on memoir, I talk about two memoirs in particular in great detail. One is Into Thin Air, and the other is Mary Carr's story.
Liars Club.
Liars Club, thank you. And I talk about, in the case of Liars Club, it was a way of thinking that her mother had in terms of how she had to be a good wife and a good mother. And this was so imprisoning to her that it was not only enslaving to her mother, it is the source of the slavery that she experienced as well, because she's constantly fighting against not just her mother, she's fighting against a whole way of thinking of being a woman and being a wife and being a mother that is ingrained in the culture. That's a huge fight to have, but it also broadens it. It makes you understand that this is a bigger fight that she had, and therefore when she succeeded in getting out of it, it's even greater, because you realize that's really tough. That's really tough. In the case of Into Thin Air, which is a very different type of memoir, and we'll talk a little bit later, I'm sure, about mixing genres with memoir to give us more plot. But Into Thin Air, it's the whole ethic of mountain climbing, and that this is climbing to the top of Mount Everest is this greatest heroism imaginable, and and therefore, because all of these climbers are locked into this way of thinking, which the author shows throughout the book, that this is a form of insanity that is going to get you killed. Because if you have that mentality on Everest at 28,000 feet, right, when the storm hits, and you can't get down, you're going to die. And they all do, or most of them do. So this is what I'm talking about going into, you try to expand the sources of the problem.
Yeah, it's so powerful what you're saying. It really resonates. And
yeah.
How about, well, I think it's a good time to actually talk about the lack of plot. And not every, I work with a lot of memoir writers, and some of them have very clear and strong plots. And obviously that's a little bit easier to work with. But let's just talk in a more global sense of, sort of the issue of plot, and, it's true life. So you're not able to make stuff up in the way that you can in other forms. So talk to us a little bit about that, and how some of your suggestions about how we can work with it.
Well, this goes to the basic distinction of memoir and all other genres, which is it is a true story. And therefore you are limited in terms of the plot beats that you can have, because those have to be things that actually happen to you, right? And so here's the problem. Some people had intense drama in their lives, which gives them plenty of plot to work with. But for most of us, there are long gaps of time between big dramatic events. There typically is no final big dramatic event, what I call the structure beat of the battle. There's no big battle or a big final conflict scene that everything can focus to. You're covering often huge lengths of time, which do not give you a natural linkage of causal events. This happened, and maybe 5 years later that happened. Those are both big dramatic events, but what's the connection to them that will allow us to build when we link them together in a plot? So all of these are elements of now, and what all of those things do is they have an effect on the story structure beats, because even though memoir is a true story, it has to be a great story. And a great story hits certain major beats. And I talk about them, first in my Anatomy of Story book, and here as well. All the genres build on these 7 major story structure steps. And the first one is weakness, need. Second one is desire. Desire is the spine that tracks the entire story, and the plot builds on that spine. These are plot events that hang on that desire line of the hero. Now, when you cover a large amount of time, and when you have no dramatic endpoint that desire line can focus to, then you have a real problem in memoir coming up with a single desire line. And if you don't have a single desire line that can track the story, it automatically becomes episodic. And this is the biggest challenge that memoir writers have, the episodic plot, which means individual events stand out, have a moment of excitement, but they don't connect and they don't build. And it's the build of all the events that makes the plot, right? Again, it's not the individual moment. And so it means that in memoir, you typically do not have that single desire line. Another key element that gives us plot is the plan. The plan is the set of guidelines or strategies that the hero is going to use to reach her goal. So if you don't have a single desire, you don't have a plan. You don't have an overall plan. And so this also contributes to the sense that we often have in memoir, which is that the hero is a victim and the hero is reactive. They are reacting to attacks from the outside. And all the other genres, because we can make up the events and string them together and make them build, we can have an active hero going after a specific goal, and therefore we've automatically got more plot than we have in the memoir, at least in the basic sense. And this is why there's a number of techniques that you can use, but the most important technique for building plot is to combine memoir with one or more other genres. Because what do the other genres have? There are plot systems. They are designed to be really great plots. So when you combine the plot of one of the other genres with your story, you're immediately kicking it up 3 or 4-fold in terms of the plot excitement and the ability to build the entire system. Now, I talk in the book, the most common way that this is done is combining memoir with thriller or detective, and especially detective, because detective matches beautifully with what's actually happening in the memoir, which is we are looking back, trying to find clues to what happened to us. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And so when we combine memoir with detective, which is about somebody trying to solve a mystery, that's exactly what a memoir writer is doing. We add these detective beats that, now one reason the detective has one of the best plots of any genre is because the puzzle they're trying to solve, they're trying to find out who killed somebody else. Well, that's very sensational, and that really helps when you're trying to get plot. But the techniques of detective and the beats of detective are also very useful in terms of making the detecting in our own life much more exciting than it would normally be. And I talk about in the book that the role of the hero in a memoir is to be a detective. You are, by your very nature, a detective of your own life.
So, and so detective, and is there another genre? Like, I mean, do you see, I guess that's the easiest to work with in terms of the plot issue. Are
Well,
there,
let me mention, I also mentioned thriller. Now, thriller is basically a detective story in which the hero gets into physical and emotional danger.
right?
So they're investigating now, and the thriller is also very good for memoir if it's a story in which that's centered within the family or a very intimate group, and the central issue that the writer is facing is that they are being attacked in some way by those intimate people. Because that's, thriller, of course, is essentially another way we could describe thriller. This is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not by much, is gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, thriller is, the classic Hitchcock thriller is, I'm in love with a guy who I think might also be a murderer.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
That's the ultimate personal relationship that is extremely dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So thriller is also a way to do it. It has all the same detective beats, or many of the same detective beats, but also has that added element that the investigator is, the more she looks into what is going on, the more danger she gets into.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very exciting. That's added plot. It's also added emotional power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are others that you could use.
What about myth?
Well, I talk in the book about the myth. In the myth form, I talk about myth just before I talk about memoir. And in many ways, they're very similar. Even though myth is very fantastical and very big picture, and memoir is very small picture, intimate, very emotional. But the combination between them is known as the personal myth.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the most exciting, areas of storytelling for me going forward, because you're getting the benefits of the strengths of both. And this is the main reason why we mix genres. First of all, it gives us a lot more plot. And in every medium, that is the ultimate requirement for popular success. But the other reason is that it allows you to get the strengths of each and try to and hide the weaknesses of each, because every story form has certain structural weaknesses that come along for the ride. They will always be there, right? We talked about some of the ones for memoir. Mm-hmm. But so when you get something like personal myth, you get the power of myth, which is this big picture journey that has some sense of fantastical elements and fantastical mystery, but you get the power of memoir. The power of memoir, if I was describing one thing, it has more emotional power than any other genre, because you're dealing with intimate characters, and especially intimate opponent. The intimate opponent is the most powerful opponent there is.
And you say intimate opponent, are you talking about something outside of the?
I'm talking about typically within the family.
Mm-hmm.
Opponents are within the family or within a group of individuals who act like a family. But they're people that the hero knows really well. Now let's contrast that to myth. Myth, hero goes on a physical journey, encountering typically opponents who are strangers. Mm-hmm. So we get big battles with those. That's exciting, but there's no intimate connection. And so that's not nearly as powerful emotionally for the audience as you get with memoir. So what if we combine the two? And we got that big picture, exciting journey plot that we get with myth, with some fantastical elements or the suggestion of fantastical elements. And we get that powerful, intimate story that we get with memoir. So
you give an example. I think one of the, isn't Almost Famous, the film Almost Famous, a personal story? It's one of my favorite films.
It's great. It's great. And you get the other examples are Cinema Paradiso, Forrest Gump, Life of Pi, Big Fish. My Life as a Dog. These are all stories that are structured based on myth, but they're using the memoir, many of the memoir beats to give it emotional grounding. And that combination is really powerful.
Great. Let's just touch on opponent for a bit, because one of the things, and I think we talked about this before, that I bump up against when I'm working with people is that they often feel like, oh, well, I'm the opponent, and I really want to talk about that internal conflict versus the external, and how they're both important, I guess.
Well, that certainly matches with my experience in working with writers. One of the first questions I ask is, who's the opponent in the story? And the writer almost always says, the opponent is himself. And they say it with great pride, like, well, I've come up with this great little trick that is, it's himself. Wow. And I always have to say, well, no, that's not actually the opponent. You've just described the first story beat of the 7 structure steps, which is weakness need. Weakness need is the internal opponent that the character is dealing with. And in any good story, you have to have both. The hero has to have an internal weakness, which is their internal opponent. They have to have an external opponent, which allows you to dramatize the story. Without that, it's just all in your head and it's navel gazing. That won't work. You have to, and it especially won't work because then you have zero plot. So we have to get both. And, now, let me say this, it makes total sense that a memoir writer would say that to you, because the weakness needs step in memoir is extremely important. It's very powerful. And I would venture to say the weakness need beat there in memoir is probably stronger than in any other genre. But we can't just end with that. We start with it, but we can't end with that. That's just the basis. That's the problem we're solving for in the story. See, a lot of writers think in any genre, they think, well, the story is about, we give the hero a goal, and then they have to go up against opponents to try to get the goal. Yeah, that's what the audience, the reader, is tracking. That's what is exciting. That's where there's plot. But the problem we're solving for is the internal problem of the character, the flaw, the deep flaw that is ruining their life. And so we just provide them a vehicle, which is a desire line and external opponents that force them to deal with that internal flaw. And in the act of trying to get the goal, they will solve the internal flaw. But that's why in memoir, you have this strong internal problem, and then you get to the opponent, which is where we get most of our plot. Because that's an intimate opponent, it's very difficult. It's another reason why it's so difficult to generate plot in a memoir.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's super helpful, the way you articulated that. Also, so one more beat, and then I think we can maybe open it up to a couple questions that are coming through here. The double self-revelation, I really liked that idea. Can you talk about that? That's towards the end.
Sure. And let me backtrack a little bit and connect it up to the double desire line.
Okay.
So in any story, of course, we start off with the weakness need. Then the next major structure step is the desire. And this is one of the ways that the memoir story structure is unique from all other forms, because we have a double desire line here. And why? Because we actually have 2 main characters. In any good memoir, you're going to have 2 main characters. And this is one of the things that so many writers, especially when they're first starting to write memoir, they don't get that sense of the 2 heroes that we're talking about. One is the hero, which is the author, who is remembering what happened and writing the story. The second hero is the author in the past when all of these events occurred.
Mhm.
And what that means is then when you're tracking and setting up the structure for the memoir, you have to set up two desire lines. The first is the desire of the author to tell this story and to remember. And the second is whatever the desire line of that character back in the past. And again, then we run into that problem. What's the single desire? It's very hard to get with memoir, but we want to try to find a single desire for that character in the past that can track the whole story and that they can go after for the whole story. Now, that leads eventually to the end of the story, where we get the self-revelation. Self-revelation is where the hero learns who she really is. That's the psychological self-revelation. In really good stories, there's also a moral self-revelation, which is where she learns how she has been wrong. Not just how others have been wrong, how she has been wrong in terms of acting toward others. So again, because we have two main characters, the hero in the present, the author, and the hero in the past, we have two desire lines, the author wanting to write the story and what happened, what she wanted in the past. We have to have two self-revelations. And here's the trick. The self-revelation that the author in the past has is often different than the self-revelation that the author in the present has. Because one of the things that you as the detective of your memoir, of your own story is doing is you're looking back at these events and you're comparing what I thought of them at the time, how I interpreted them at the time, and usually got them wrong. And now, with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of writing my memoir, I can see, no, that wasn't what was happening at all. This is what was really happening. And this is the mistake that I made in interpreting it. And it's only the act, and this is very important for a great memoir. We want to show that the act of telling the memoir, the act of remembering what happened as a whole, is why I've been able to make the change in who I am going forward.
And I feel like that's my experience, is that an author, it's not until they have written the memoir, almost in some ways, oftentimes don't even know the ending until they get to the ending, because they're making connections that they wouldn't, only in the writing of the story. I mean, it's quite literal what you're saying. It's not just an idea.
And that ties in with the detective thing is we don't know the answer to the puzzle when we first started writing the memoir. Right? We've got a frame, but we don't know the answer, because the answer is, who am I? Who am I really? And I don't know. And so and sometimes, like in any detective story, as I look back at these events, I see false clues. I read the clue this way, but that was the incorrect interpretation. And it's only by looking at all the clues together that I'm able to see what the right pattern, what the true story is of who I am. And it's an exciting process. That's why doing it as a detective story is so fun to write, because that series of reveals that you keep getting in the act of writing your story are so, often just mind-blowing. Like I was completely wrong about that, and because I was wrong about that, it brought me years of pain.
Yay.
Yeah, but no more. Right.
Yeah. It's hard work, but you're really bringing forward like the exciting part of it too. So, okay, I have to ask you this before. I'm sorry, you guys. One more question before I open it up. I really want to talk about the female myth, because you did mention when I heard you speak previously that it is a genre. I don't know if it's a subgenre that is growing.
Subgenre.
And I'm wondering, well, one, what it is, if you could talk about that, and two, so many of the people that I work with aren't exclusively women, but so many of them are women who are coming and writing personal stories. And I'm wondering if there's any link between this growing subgenre of female myth and the fact that so many women are writing their stories.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. I think it's a major story form going forward in the next few decades and beyond. And I'm going to try to be brief. It's a huge subject, but I want to be brief. The normal thinking about myth is the view of Joseph Campbell that there is this monomyth and there's these beats that happen in it, and all stories do that. In fact, I strongly disagree with that. I believe that what he is tracking there is the male warrior myth. And the reason for that is that the male warrior myth wiped out the female myth about 3,000 years ago. Literally, this happened 3,000 years ago when these warrior societies wiped out agricultural societies. And so for the last 3,000 years in Western culture, all we've had is male warrior myth. So obviously, we're going to interpret that as this is the only story to tell. Well, just in the last 10 to 15 years, the female myth has started to return. And it's returning huge. And interestingly enough, and it surprises people, the first place where it really hit big internationally was in the first Avatar. Because the first Avatar is really about a character who goes from male myth to female myth. And many of the beats in that story, especially as you move into the second half of the story, are all female myth beats. Now,
so what is a female myth?
So there are a number of beats in the female myth that are different from the male myth. Now, the easiest way to describe it is to see where they come from. The male myth comes from the hunt. We have a single goal. We very focused on that. We have opponents who are going to prevent us, but we get the final kill. Female myth is based on the agricultural cycle of the seasons. So we get birth, growth, eventual decline, death, and resurrection, rebirth, and we begin the entire cycle again. So one is linear, the other is circular. And the best way thematically to see the difference is that male myth is about divide and conquer. Female myth is about combine and grow. Fundamental opposites. Now, this is where we get to the great problem of writing the female myth. Because in the last 3,000 years, it's all been about this male warrior approach. It's all about conflict. And we all know, we've heard it drummed into our heads a million times. It's all, the more conflict, the better. That's drama. Drama equals conflict. Well, the ultimate expression of conflict is the final battle. And in male warrior myth, it's a big physical battle where everybody gets killed, right? A lot of death. Now, I contend that is not the way we want to be solving problems in the world today. The female myth approach is a much better, much healthier approach. But what that means is it's about decreasing the conflict. It's about making so that conflict is not necessary to solve the problem. It's about making physical conflict is the last resort. And so, but what that means is that instead of a plot where you're going to build conflict steadily until the final battle, when you have the biggest physical conflict of all, it's still a journey story, but you're going to emphasize the intellect of the character to try to solve, and because you're running up against obstacles and opponents along the path, still getting that. The question is, how do we deal with them? In the male warrior myth, you kill them, and there's just a different way of killing them based on how they attack. Well, female myth is about whatever this obstacle is, how do I outsmart it? And therefore, I can continue on my journey to get my goal without coming into physical conflict would be the end of both of us. So this is why, one reason why, for example, in Avatar, we have a strong overlay of male myth as well, which gives us a lot of male myth beats, which are still valuable in terms of exciting plot. But if you look at some of the films that are in this category, and let me just read them off to you, because they're not a lot of them, but what there are fantastic. Wizard of Oz, which is really way ahead of its time. L. Frank Baum, way ahead of his time. Inside Out, Avatar, The Piano, Gravity, and Arrival. And if you look at how the characters solve problems in those stories, obviously it's not about wielding the sword. It's about using the mind, the higher level of our humanity, to solve the problem. Now, that doesn't, again, there's always baggage in every one of these genres. There's baggage that's inherent structural problems. When you do solve problems like that over the course of the journey, it is going to lack some excitement that you get with the male warrior approach. It's going to happen. And you have to figure out other things that you can do in the story that can make up for it. And one of the best ways to do it is the personal myth. In other words, combining myth. And this is why memoir writers have this great advantage, because that's one of the best ways, if not the best way, to solve the inherent problem of the female myth, which is you get the strength and the benefit of that the memoir gives you. And there's some of the examples that I mentioned before of these great personal myth stories where you get the fantastical element that you get with myth, but you get the great emotion that you get with memoir.
Really?
I can't emphasize enough to writers. Now, let me just give your listeners a caution. Simply putting a woman in the role of a male warrior myth story is not a female myth. Wonder Woman is not a female myth, right? We're talking about an essentially different way of structuring the story.
Right. Does that affect, I mean, do all of your structure, going back to the anatomy of story, do all of your structure beats still apply to this sort of circular, combine and grow female story structure?
Yes, they do, because we're still, the problem we're still solving for is the internal weakness in Inside Out. It is literally an internal weakness that she has, right? And we still have to set up a desire line to give us a track to ride down. We still have to have opponents. We still have to have a plan for how we're going to solve the problem. We still have to have a final conflict. It's not going to necessarily be a conflict where we're at war with each other, right? We still need a self-revelation as the true payoff of the story. So yeah, all the beats apply. What the genres do is they hit these beats in a fundamentally different way from each other.
Yeah. And what I love, just to sort of wrap up or sort of land on a really positive beat for memoir, is that you talk about in each of the chapters in each of the genres how you can transcend the genre. And I love that you say with memoir, you've already inherently transcended the genre. Can you just explain why?
It is inherently thematic. And the way you transcend a genre, it's actually, there are a lot of techniques that go into it. But what you're really talking about is dealing with theme, expressing theme. Because theme is how the genre expresses the life philosophy that's embedded in the plot. And each has its own life philosophy. Well, the very act of doing memoir is theme. It's what made my life unique, what made my life valuable, and what patterns can I see that can help me change my life going forward. That is all theme. And in fact, again, one of the challenges is that it's not just theme. That's why we need plot to hide the fact that we're trying to give some message in terms of life philosophy. We don't want to just hit them with life philosophy. They're going to say no. Right. That's why plot is such an important vehicle for getting that message across.
Great. I wanted to, there's a question that came through. Thank you so much for all of this.
Sure.
Just, you're getting, no one wants you to leave, John. Everyone is completely
I'm happy to
engaged.
talk as long as you want.
So we're bumping up against the hour. Do you have maybe 10 minutes to take some questions or so?
Sure.
I wanted to ask Miriam if you wanted to ask your question live. If not, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, I can ask. I just
Okay.
it came to me in the moment. So
Great.
thank you so much, John. This has been an incredible conversation
Great.
to witness.
Sure.
So I was curious when you were talking about this opponent and how it, like we have these external opponents. When I'm thinking about my own story, my opponent is an event that ends up like following me throughout like 21 years. Like, so my event is 9/11.
Yeah.
It just killed my dad, and then it killed my mom and gave me cancer. And so like
Right.
this whole story unfolds, and it's like a very cyclical thing. So the female myth really resonated as well. But I was curious, like, can 9/11 be my opponent versus like a person in my life? Because
It can be the source of the opponent. Remember at the beginning, we were talking about that system of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that is. It is this event that had such massive repercussions, which played out specifically for you in your life with this, and this happening. But we always want to, anytime you're trying to express a system, it's crucial that you have characters to represent the system, because otherwise we have nothing dramatic that we can go up against, right? So what you want to do is come up with, because this single event had these effects on your life personally, then you have to think, what were the opponents that were created or that I created that I was fighting against? Maybe I didn't even need to fight against them, but you're going to find that out over the course of the story. But the point is, you need some external opponents that can allow you to dramatize what this deeper system is. What you're dealing with is very similar to what you get with stories with where the opponent is the natural world. For example, there's an earthquake, right?
Or Into the Wild, maybe,
Into the Wild is a perfect example of that. You get massive opposition, but because it's from a natural event, it's very difficult to build from it. We need human opponents in order to make the story kick up to a higher level and really get into the deepest parts of who you are and how did this change you as a person over the course of your life.
And can they be a series of opponents along the way? It doesn't have to be.
It probably will be.
Yeah.
They probably, as I say, that's part of the baggage that memoir has that we often have. We often have multiple desire lines, and we often have multiple opponents who are not as connected as they are in some of the fiction genres.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So your opponent can be different than your antagonist. Is that?
No, that's
No, they're the same thing.
They're the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
I just use a different word for it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I thought Kristen had your hand up. Where are you? Maybe not.
I had a quick question. It's not that important of a question, but when you started talking about the female myth, or examples of the female myth, I instantly thought of The Fugitive. And I'm trying to, would you consider The Fugitive the female myth meets thriller?
No,
because he's not, he's trying to
well, it's an
outsmart-
interesting question, because Fugitive has a journey plot, which is the fundamental, the most important distinctive structural feature of the myth form. But just because there's a journey doesn't mean necessarily that it is a myth story. So what you're doing is you're getting a thriller. It's essentially a thriller, but it is a thriller in which the character goes on a mythical type of journey. But it really doesn't hit, partly because it doesn't really hit any of the themes that the female myth is all about. He's more or less, because he's so at a disadvantage compared to the cops, he's inherently reactive, being the fugitive. This is why, of course, it was originally a TV show. It was an anthology show where we could have a different episode literally every week.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just strung those together in the film. And I thought they did a very good job of that. But yeah, it's still essentially a thriller with a journey plot.
Okay, thanks.
We have a question in the chat that says, is it possible to have a clear and clean outline if part of the process of writing a memoir can mean that you're acting as your own detective?
Well, it's an interesting question in the sense that just because the outcome of the puzzle is not known by you as the memoir writer, still the structure of how you go about it is known. That's the outline that you want to have. And that leaves you free to be creative at when you get to these individual reveal points. What you, as the author, come up with at that moment is fluid, and it can be whatever it is when you have it. That's the exciting part of it. But if you don't have that overall outline, that detective outline for you to follow the path, you won't get to those reveals in the first place.
Interesting. Great.
I always say that structure increases creativity, doesn't decrease it. Structure is what makes creativity possible. And that means in part that you don't want a structure that is so locked down, an outline that's so locked down that you know exactly everything that is going to happen, especially when it comes to the reveals. But it means that you have an overall structure, and that's what genres do. They give you that overall beat structure that allows you to execute those beats in different ways. And that's the main way you transcend any genre, is how you execute the beat that everybody knows. How you execute it, you're going to make it unique in a way that's never been seen or done before.
Jan?
So feel free not to answer this, but how do we hear more of you?
Well,
So I have your book, and I saw you at Barnes & Noble. It was so great, and your book is great, but to hear you and to particularly to talk about memoir and also the female myth, how do we hear you more?
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. The way you hear me more is with people like Karin invite me to talk and talk story. I will talk story anytime, any place, and so happy to do it. But
so can we reach out to you and create another time where you would talk with us?
Of course, of course.
Okay.
So
my name is Jan, and I'm going to do that through Karin, if you don't mind, because I think it's extraordinary, and I just feel like all of us in this room are desperate to hear more of what you've just said. And so if you're game, I would be so grateful.
You're very kind, and again, it is a joy for me to talk story and specifically memoir with you. I love the form. I love the courage of memoir writers, because I think it is the most courageous form to write. And
thank you. And we love the men in our group also. So this is not meant to exclude the men, but everything you just said about the female myth and how it is new and kind of groundbreaking, I think each of us feels that. And whether or not it's, it's kind of isolating and like, is this just me? But so to hear you say all of these things about kind of the female myth, the female journey, the female memoir right now in time, I'm desperate to hear that, and I'm desperate to know more. And
that's partly anytime you're coming from a loss of 3,000 years for a major type of storytelling, and the theme that comes with that, when it suddenly comes onto the scene, it's like mind-blowing. It's certainly mind-blowing to me when I first saw what was happening. And so, and it's also empowering for so many people to suddenly find out that the story that they've been wanting to tell is not only valuable, but it has will make tremendous difference in the world.
Mm.
So there is no subgenre of story that I am more excited about going forward than the female myth.
Mm.
And I can tell you, having talked about female myth all over the world in the last 10 years, there is no genre that everybody else is more excited about
Mm.
than female myth. It is huge.
Mhm. Amazing. That's so exciting. Two more questions, and then I just want to be respectful of John's time here. Megan? Is she there?
Hi, sorry about that.
There.
How do you recommend approaching the discernment process of writing a piece as a memoir versus a work of fiction, or, like a screenplay in a fiction and in a genre?
Well, the first thing I always say to writers now is, if you have a good story idea, whatever genre you're going to use to tell it as a memoir or as a work of fiction. Do not tell it first as a screenplay. And that is because you have 100% chance of getting what you write out to the world if you write as a memoir or as a work of fiction. You have 0.0001 chance of getting it out to the world as a screenplay. I can't tell you how many thousands of screenwriters that I know that have bookshelves like this, with stacks of screenplays that they have written and never saw the light of day. So if there was a great story in there, too bad.
Okay.
It ain't going anywhere.
And
the other benefit of that is that once it gets out to the world and you start to get a following, you start to build a story brand as somebody who is telling their story and they're telling it well, then that starts to get notoriety. And then they come to you, say, hey, we want to make this as a film. Obviously, that doesn't happen often, but it doesn't happen often for anybody in terms of film. But the point is, that's how if it's going to work, that's how it's going to work. You never want to go to them. You want them to come to you. Now, in terms of sussing it out and as to what genre it should be, there's actually a lot of techniques that go into that. It is the first decision that you make when you come up with your premise line, and it is probably where most writers go wrong. Because if you choose the wrong genre as the vehicle, as the plot vehicle for that story idea, you really screwed it up. And it's really hard to recover from that. And all I can say is, the simple answer is, read the book. When you come up with and the idea of the genres will be embedded in that premise.
Okay.
And typically 2 or 3 genres will be embedded in that premise. And what you want to do is find out what is the primary genre. You want to use those other genres, but what is the primary genre for telling this story? And in the whole book is about techniques for doing that, not only figuring out what is the right genre for this premise idea, but also then what are the steps to execute all the way to the final book?
Okay. Thank you.
Jody, final question here.
Hi, thanks so much. John, you're blowing my mind.
I think that's a good thing.
It's an amazing thing. I just wanted to say that, first of all, thank you. And second of all, I've always been obsessed with Wizard of Oz. And I keep coming back to, I just want to plug my memoir story into the Wizard of Oz and sort of make it up. Is that ripping off something? And is that a bad idea?
Ripping off is how the entire story industry works. No, it's not. The question is, what do you do with it? It's what do you do with it? It's I don't know how many of the Jane Austen in the modern day stories have we had. Is that, how many Mr. Darcys in the modern day have we had? That's great. How many Sherlock Holmes in the modern day have we had? It's the trick is, what are you going to pull from it? And then how are you going to modify it to make it unique to you that only you could have written? And this is part of the entire process of how do you transcend a genre. And I talk in the book, the basic idea of the book is don't just hit the genre, transcend it, which means hit all those beats, but then do them in a way that has never been done before and express the deeper theme in a way that really gets to the heart of what this life philosophy is all about. So if you start off with The Wizard of Oz, the question is, which parts of it are you going to pull? What is it that's exciting to you enough that you want to take the time and the pain to write that as your own story? But the whole trick is going to be, what do you do to make it original? But don't worry about the fact that, oh, I'm ripping off this or that, especially if it's in the public domain, because that's what genres are. They are generic story forms that then people just simply repeat ad infinitum.
I mean, how many Cinderella stories have people written?
Right. Exactly. It's these are the great stories that are so powerful because they do so many things so well, and they do it in a unique way that we haven't seen before, and unique take on it. And so we love to see that done again with new skin.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Thank you. I appreciate that.
John, it's been a pleasure and an incredible conversation, and thank you so much. So
well, thank you, Karin. As you know, I love talking with you. I'm so happy to be here with everybody, and it's just been so much fun. Obviously, I love talking about story, and I especially love talking about memoir, but thank you for the opportunity to be able to do that.